It's very possible that this is the most common joint in woodworking. The rabbet. It might be the most ubiquitous joint in woodworking. And the more I thought about this, the more I think this might actually be true, because it exists in cabinetry, it exists in furniture, it exists in construction really in its own way, like a laminated rabbet joint. But that's neither here nor there for our purposes. I need to cut some rabbets to create more or less a one-sided tenon on the internal components of a project I'm working on right now, and I thought that I would show you a few different techniques you can use to do that depending on the scale on which you work. But the more I thought about it, the more I really do think this might be a correct statement. If you're making kitchen cabinets, on a production scale, on a large cabinet shop scale, you're using the rabbet as more or less all of your construction joinery. Top, bottom, everything sandwiched together. You may use a butt joint, sure, but oftentimes they're using a rabbet. And then often box makers on a small scale are going to use a rabbet because it's just easy to execute in small parts and it's efficient. And then of course in furniture, there's any number of variations of the rabbet that you're going to employ. You could make the argument that a half lap is a variation on a rabbet. In this spot, it really is creating like a one-sided, I'm sure it has a name. I don't know what you would call that joint specifically if you only have one shoulder on your tenon. We're gonna call it a one-shoulder tenon for right now because I don't know if it is called anything specific other than that. But regardless of what we are calling it, there are any number of ways to cut a rabbet, to execute this joint accurately and efficiently. You could do it with a router, you can do it with a table saw, you can do it with hand tools, depending on how you like to work. But for today's purposes, I'm going to show you 3 variations, 2 on the table saw, 1 on the router, that any woodworker in any situation, so long as they have basic power tool equipment, can execute efficiently and accurately. So let's get to it. The first technique we're going to talk about, the dado stack. Now, does everybody have a dado stack? No, I get it. And for our international viewers, you may know that a dado stack is illegal in some countries in the European Union. I don't know how many, but I do know in the UK, if they're not outright illegal, they are severely frowned upon. However, they are common practice here in the States. And if you're working in a cabinet shop, this is probably the most common way you're going to cut a rabbet, especially when you're dealing with larger sheet goods in order to build things like kitchen cabinets. And of course, I want to give you options. I'm going to show you some other techniques that you can use on smaller pieces that would be unwieldy or inefficient to use on larger sheet goods. So let's get the dado stack set up and I'm going to show you how we're going to do this. Now, I don't actually care how wide my dado stack is at the moment because I'm not cutting a dado. The only thing I care about is that it's wider than the rabbet I need to cut. And we're gonna offset that extra width by adding an auxiliary fence to our table saw fence. I'm simply gonna take a spare piece of wood that I had lying around in the stacks. I'm gonna bury it into the blade. Now, you could be a good fancy boy and have like the headless clamps and drill a couple of holes in here and make a whole fancy jig out of it. But so long as your clamps are higher than the piece of wood you're cutting a rabbet in, you're gonna be just fine. And just like that, with a single cut, I've got a perfect 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch rabbet. Now you can see how taking the time to set up a dado stack accurately can really save you a lot of time when it comes to cutting a ton of rabbets. But some folks may not have access to a dado stack. Some folks may just not want to use it. Or the materials you're using may not be the appropriate size for a dado stack. There's a lot of torque on that blade you may not want to use for a small to mid-size furniture component. So what do you do in that situation? Our second method is just what I call the L cut. I don't know, the 2 cut, I don't know, it could be called any number of things. I call it the L cut because I'm making an L basically. Is it every rabbet in L? I don't, disregard what I just said. That doesn't make any sense. But essentially what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna use a flat top blade in my table saw. I'm gonna make 1 cut with this orientation, and then I'm gonna set up my fence, and I'm gonna make another cut in this orientation. It's very efficient, and for kind of a small to mid-sized component like this, it's very easy to handle on the table saw. So it's an easy way to get things done quickly and efficiently if you've got a wide rabbet. Now the downside to this method is that it does take 2 setups. I'm gonna set up this cut first, and then I'm gonna come in here and set up this cut second. So you may be losing a little bit of time in that regard, but if you've only got 1 or 2 cuts to make, then it may still be faster than actually going through the process of setting up a dado stack. So, as you can see, compared from the dado stack to the L cut, same quality of cut, same quality of joinery, perfectly accurate. The only downside really is that this is a 2-stage setup. And then of course, you get this pesky little offcut that you saw, which can cause problems from time to time. So 2 things I'll say about that. Number 1, always have that offcut to the outside of the blade. That's the safest place for it to be. Secondly, if what happens is that offcut drops into the throat plate like you saw, don't freak out, just pause, turn the machine off, make sure it's not going to go anywhere, or step away from the machine, and then when the blade stops, you can get in there and remove it. Don't freak out with the machine on, you'll be just fine. Just make sure you turn it off and step away. It happens, that's the nature of woodworking, that's the nature of machine woodworking, it's not the end of the world. Now, what if your component is a little too small to make that L cut? Or if your machine for some reason doesn't have a square fence, it's a little bit tricky to actually make that cut accurately. There's one more technique that I use that's probably the most common technique I use to cut this joint. So let me show you that. So this is what I call the nibble cut. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna establish my shoulder. I'm gonna make this first cut, and then I'm just gonna remove the waste by repeated cuts. Now you can see yet again, there's very consistent quality in these cuts. And that may be a safer technique to use on smaller bits because you don't have to stand it up on edge. You can use a push stick the entire time. The downside to that technique, of course, is that you have to take 4 or 5 cuts every time. So if I've got 15 components to cut, it's gonna take me 4 or 5 times as long than if I was doing the L cut or the dado stack. But for small components, for tiny bits that you need to be safe on, the nibble technique is brilliant. Speaking of brilliant, this video is sponsored by Brilliant. You saw that coming this time, didn't you? Brilliant.org is the best way to learn math and science interactively. Brilliant has thousands of lessons that can help refine and advance your woodworking skills, from everyday math to physics and engineering, to a course called Beautiful Geometry, which helps you think intuitively about patterns and ratios, and new lessons are added every month. Now, if you're still wondering why you should use Brilliant's online interactive lessons to learn rather than just trial and error in the shop, let me spin you a little tale. I was a curious kid. I was the type of kid who would crawl under decks to figure out how they stayed up. I would ask you to go in your basement or your attic in your house just to like look around and see what happens. I actually did this at the Wharton Esherick Museum one time. I asked if I could go in the attic and she laughed at me. She let me, but she laughed at me. So I'm still a very curious person. But when I was 8 or 9, probably, I decided one day that I was going to take apart my parents' camcorder. You know, the kind that like weighed 37 pounds and cost your newborn child, sat up on your shoulder, that kind of jam. And I took it into my room and I grabbed a couple of my dad's screwdrivers and I started dissecting it. I just started taking things out and I was discovering all of these chips and bits and wires that I had no idea what they did. And it dawned on me pretty soon that not only had I no idea how it actually functioned, I didn't have any idea how to put it back together. Yeah. I don't think I saw the sun for like a week after that. So don't be like me. Learn smarter, not harder. So if you're still curious about how the world works but don't want to actually receive the biggest whooping of your lifetime, maybe try Brilliant. If you want to try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, you can visit brilliant.org/Encurtis or click the link down in the description. The first 200 of you will get 20% off your annual premium subscription. Now our last technique for cutting rabbets is going to be done on the router table. I'm going to cut my actual components for the project I'm working on during this technique, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, I have a really nice, fresh, sharp router bit in here, which is going to give me really clean results in a material that can be a little bit punky, a little bit variable. Number two, this is not just any regular router table, and I need these to be super, super accurate because of all of the different joinery components that are actually happening in here. So these rabbets need to be absolutely dead on. So having a machine that's digitally calibrated like this is a huge benefit. So in this router table, I already have a big ol' honkin' rabbeting bit. No idea what the diameter of this is, but probably around 2 inches. You could certainly make these cuts with like a 1/2 inch router bit, given that my rabbet is only a 1/4 inch by a 1/4 inch, but I've got this, so I'm gonna use it. Smooth as eggs. So our shell is assembled, and just so you have some inclination of what the hell I just did here, why don't we take a look inside and you can see how all of those rabbets are lining up. So effectively what I have inside this box is I have a box up top here, which is gonna be like a till. There's gonna be a lid here. And then I've got a runner for 2 drawers that are gonna sit inside here. And this second box down here is going to house the drawer that's out front. Now you may be asking yourself what this hole back here is for. You're just gonna have to watch the final build video to find that out. But the process, you can see, cutting these rabbets and then kind of using them as stub tenons, if you will, to create all of this internal joinery, makes for a relatively easy assembly, even though this is gonna have its own complications when I go to glue this up. So friends, that's that. That's rabbets. Not a complicated joint to cut, and something that you can do in an infinite number of ways. This was not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination. So if there are other ways that you like to do it, that's fine. It's all about finding the ways that work for you, whether that be from an efficiency standpoint if you're a professional, or just finding the way that you enjoy doing it the most if you're a hobbyist. There's no wrong way to do it. There's just different ways to do it. So that's that. I'm gonna get back to doing this because I need to make some movement on this box, and I need to make a bottom now that you see that I don't have one yet, but that's coming soon. So friends, till next week, cheers.